Hello, post Mobile World Congress. We have another bit by bit where we'll break down what was interesting, what needed more attention, what got should have got highlighted that maybe didn't, and a range of other things. I am Ben Bajarin, joined by my colleague Carolina Milanesi. Hello, Carolina.
Hi, I'm
All
still
right,
jet lagged.
you're still jet lagged. You got back Friday-ish, something like that. Spent a good amount of time in Mobile World Congress. So let's start. I wasn't there, but following it from afar, one of my first kind of takeaways was there was way more talk around AI than at CES. I think we went into CES expecting we would hear things like we saw at Mobile World Congress. To be honest with you, I kind of expected that vibe to be on stage, but obviously, Mobile World Congress is a mobile show, so it would make more sense that people in making handsets, making devices, would pay more attention, right, to that for now. But sort of just takeaway, right? You were there. What was that kind of big picture sense on the narrative for AI? Was there too much talk? Was there not enough? Did you feel like where we're at in this cycle, it was the right amount of AI? Or again, is this just still a bit too much? We're searching for use cases and everybody's still just throwing stuff out there.
I think it depends whether you were looking at consumer versus enterprise, which is probably explaining why there was a lot of focus. It's definitely there was no shortage of AI as a topic around the show. But to me, that says that the enterprise side is the one where there's more clarity as to what the use cases are and the positive impact that AI can have, mostly on productivity, right? It was interesting that, rightly you point out that this is a kind of mobile show, but it hasn't really, and it wasn't this year, been a lot about smartphones. The first thing that you notice when you're there is the smartphone market is obviously more vibrant in Europe because there are Chinese brands that play a big role in the market, and that's what you saw. You saw Oppo and OnePlus and Xiaomi and Honor all displaying phones and all talking about AI, although not in a very clear way. But it was also interesting that at this mobile show we had two non-mobile or not, the first brands that you think about on stage as keynoters. One was, I don't mean that's a word and I just made up, but it's okay. One was Microsoft and the other one was Dell. Microsoft, ironically, the brand that missed mobile altogether, here keynoting at Mobile World Congress, and Dell really much focus on really innovation and driving change in the carrier market. And so talking about digital transformations for carriers, also not a brand that you usually associate with mobile. But that's what, in my opinion, boils down to. The enterprise is a shorter, more real opportunity for AI than consumer is.
Mm. I mean, I think that makes sense. We've sort of talked about that broadly, in enterprise. I think they're also sort of a breakdown into what are those key use cases that even an enterprise is going to care about. Yet, as you saw at the show, there was a lot more attempts to put a consumer narrative around some of these things. And when I looked at what a lot of the brands were doing, what a lot of the semi companies who make chips for these platforms were doing, it kind of feels like the industry needs to get to a certain point where, one, you have enough compute out there in devices in order to flesh out these use cases, right? It can't just be one product on the high end before an ecosystem moves. So it feels like we're ticking in that direction. There will be enough devices that people will start exploring, again, whether that's an enterprise company writing software for smartphones or consumer applications, or even at the platform level, whether that's Apple or Android, we're at least getting, you know, some foundation of the right technology out there. And that to me was sort of that all has to happen before broader use cases start to make a lot of sense. The other thing I thought about, and I'm curious on your perspective on this because you've lived internationally, you're also not a native United Statesman. I'm wondering if we're jaded. Like the United States may not be as impressed, because I thought about this and I had a conversation with somebody where even the small amount of use cases we've talked about, apparently there's actually some excitement in China because people are like, "That's amazing," you know, and we're like, "Eh," you know. And I also wonder if like parts of Europe or India, where they've just not had 30 years of technology, might see some of these things and actually think they're more useful before we do, because they may see more applications, they may see more complex problems. So I do wonder if there's other markets that might be much more interested in some of these things. Even the use case that I want you to talk about around, you know, stable diffusion. Like, again, I just kind of feel like we look at that and we go, that's not that useful. But another market might look at that and say, this actually solves a really big problem for us, or spurs an innovation cycle that we didn't think about, because I think we are typically a little bit of a jaded market.
I don't know if it's because the US is jaded versus because the US is such a homogeneous market when it comes to, think about languages and as an example, right? Translation, light translation is one of the most
Mm-hmm.
common use cases that you see. Samsung talked about it when they came out at Unpacked with the Galaxy S24, with the collaboration with Google. And you look at the US, although the US has a very high percentage of households that are bilingual, it's not something that you live every day.
Right.
You go to Europe, where people travel a lot within Europe, and there are so many different languages spoken. That's a useful use case. You're looking at India, where there are several languages in a country. That's a useful use case. You look at China, where, you exit China, nobody speaks Chinese, and I'm generalizing, but, and then it becomes useful. So I think that there's a little bit of that. There's also, I think in general, I actually think that people, and I'm trying to be politically correct here, but there's, I wouldn't put it as the US is jaded versus on a positive side versus other countries where there's definitely more a more positive attitude towards technology
Right.
than there is in the US, right? And
Right.
I think it's because probably part of that, being jaded is because we talk about technology way more here than we do, or you hear in other markets, because
Right.
the technology in the US becomes a political topic as well, right? And especially when you're looking at the big five, and the conversation around how much tech controls from a policy perspective, as well as just a GDP perspective. So I think it's a combination of all of that.
Yeah, but I think you hit kind of exactly what I was thinking about, which was, I think other markets might be different, more different in their interest level to these things than
Right.
we are. Which I make that point to say, because a lot of people look at, you know, AI on device and some of these use cases we're going to talk about and just say that's not compelling enough for me to use, like, and they'll write it off because of that. Whereas I do wonder if other markets, those things might actually be much more appreciated than we're giving them credit for, and so therefore
Yeah.
showing something like, real time stable diffusion, image generation, image editing, even elements of creative, even maybe just some localized chatbot that solves a problem right directly for you, maybe far more useful, even when, though it's not oppressive to us, to other markets, which makes the case like that's why it's important to do these things. Like, don't write off the whole, don't throw the whole thing out just because you don't see the use case for yourself.
We also have to remember how much more dependent other markets compared to the US are on mobile, right? There are countries that run on mobile, India being one. When it comes to banking, when it comes to education,
Right.
so much more is run on a mobile phone versus a PC. China is the same. And, we're not quite there. I need to remind people of that don't live in the US that people still write checks here. So, hey, there's just a different level of dependence on mobile and mobile services and mobile applications in other markets that there is here in the US.
Right. Right. So let's talk about some of the demos that went on. You got to see a little bit of evolution. I would say nothing's brand new. No use cases we're talking about haven't been shown before, either at CES or toward the end of last year by mobile OEMs. But they've gotten a little better, right? The technology is a little better than it was 6 months ago. It's not maybe a brand new demo. It's been fleshed out. So what were some of the things that you saw that at least solidified some of these use cases that we can justify will have some existence on local client hardware?
Yeah, there were a couple. Obviously, a lot of the work done on cameras and photos is, for me, still the most compelling use case for consumers because it's immediate, but is also touching on something that always rides on strong emotions, right? So if you're able to do the erase function where you're taking a picture of the Sagrada Familia because we're in Barcelona, and of course as you're taking the picture there's a car driving past or a pedestrian, being able to take that out and have a perfect picture is
Right.
great. So I think that was there's a lot, I think, that rides on the ability to end up with a great shot, not necessarily, taking the pictures, but getting a shot. The other one that I saw that was, if you like, I saw Stable Diffusion, and I'm pretty sure that I generated a hairless cat with a head last year at Mobile World Congress with Qualcomm. There was, faster, better this year. And then I saw on the MediaTek stand a kind of a on the fly generation. So as you were typing, the picture was being created and changed as you finish your query. So if you start with, show a bear, you'll see a bear in a setting. And then if you want the bear in the office, that setting would change with the office in the background instead of the woods, or kind of a more obvious. And what was fascinating for me with that demo was almost understanding the context that the AI was taking in generating that picture. That is, with the familiarity of things that and the data that is fed into the model to generate what you wanted, which ironically made me think about the importance of creating a data set that is as unbiased as we can possibly have it, because seeing how things were generated on the fly and knowing that they are dependent on the information that you have made it a little bit too real for me, and I think we need more of that. And this is was a big topic of conversation with Microsoft about bias and fairness from an AI perspective. The other demo that I saw that I think would get us to have a whole conversation about where AI is going to be showcased, if it is PC and phones or something else, was obviously AI Pin with Humane. They were showcasing a series of demos on the Apple, listen to me, on the Qualcomm stand. and because there's Qualcomm inside. And so, although they don't talk openly about what actually silicon is inside, but there is. And I think that the poor woman who was doing the demo must have been the most sought after person in the whole show, because she literally did not stop over the 4 days of the show. And I thought that that was more compelling than it was initially shown. But similar use cases. So, languages was one,
Right.
translating and
Right.
asking queries around, Barcelona or, food or whatever, which raised the question to me is, okay, well, what's the advantage of having a standalone AI versus something that is integrated in my phone, because I already have a phone. So
Yeah.
why do I need something separate? And I
Right.
think that is more to me a business model reason than not necessarily a use case or, if you like, a user convenience drive. I don't know what
Right.
you think.
Well, I mean, I think I've put them similarly with Rabbit, right, and I expect we'll see more. Um, as kind of frontier tech, meaning people who are trying to break new ground, go new places, and it's just discovery, right? Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but we need people to try things and fail and or succeed. Like that's the big companies aren't going to do it. They'll be more cautious in their approach. So I think this concept of tech frontier, tech discovery is a good one. I think you got to look at it and say, what's useful. Like you said, is this an augmentation of a current device? Is there something that you can do with this device that you can't do with other things? And I think that's really what they're focusing on as well. But I also think, part of our earlier point remains, might a remote part of India think this is really useful, right? Who maybe is not as entrenched to their phones as we are, right? Same as China, right? Or younger people. So there's potential there in how it evolves. So again, somebody's got to do it. I think they need to be able to adapt quickly from user interface paradigms that just don't work or don't translate to mass market, or as they have shown, and I think people have given them feedback on the display interface on your hand. There's just a lot of friction there. It is too slow, right? There's voice would be faster. It can't take 20 extra seconds to do something that you're used to doing instantaneously. That's going backwards in UX. So I think there's evolutions of those that will happen. But I think they and others are just trying to figure out really what the staple use cases are, and then whether that, like, goes into a Meta Ray-Bans, goes into a future version of whatever Apple does, like that will happen, right? There's some convenience to not holding your phone and doing things, as I think we would agree with something like Vision Pro or even the Meta smart glasses. It's nice to just talk to something or have it function. You need to pull out a device to do it. It's letting your hands be free. There's value there, but it's a brand new paradigm, and that's the hardest part.
Yeah, the your hands being free with the Meta glasses is amazing, especially when you're trying to do demos and you're trying to show people. That's been my go-to instead of trying to do it with a separate phone or camera. But I wonder, to your point about experimentation, if we are here at a, so there's two reasons. One, for me, I can only think that, Rabbit or Humane are all trying not to be lost within a phone, right?
Sure,
Because
sure.
that becomes so much easy to be disenfranchised if you're there. But the other thing is, it reminds me a little bit of Alexa in the early days, and everything's gonna go off in my office, where we were forced to learn to use voice because there wasn't an alternative, there wasn't a screen to fall back to. And here is the same. In both cases, we need to try and figure out how the world is going to work without us being consumed, with a screen. And I wonder if that's just a useful exercise to start with, to then figure out what works best when. in a world where you are talking about, computing being everywhere around you.
Yeah, I mean, and I think right. If anybody's read anything we've written for a while, right, this idea of ambient compute and ambient AI has merit. Like you try them and you agree. There's some usefulness here. Um,
Yeah.
I think the fallacy that people get into, and I've made this point with many people in the last week, is for whatever reason, while you all were all in Mobile World Congress, like reporters were hitting us all up for other stuff, largely Apple, because of a host of things, and then we'll get to some Apple stuff in a minute. But I think the point that gets lost is everybody says, well, what's coming out is going to replace other things, when the reality is we all have smartphones and we still have PCs. It did not replace the
Right.
PC, it augmented it. We use them in conjunction. And my theory is that will continue. We'll get these devices and it will just be a part of our ambient or our personal computing ecosystem. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just every device has a role. But you have to be able to do something on those products that you can't do on the other two. It needs to fill a void. And that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned the PC and the phone, because one of the most compelling demos that I saw in Mobile World Congress was actually Motorola's Smart Connect, where, the phone and the PC, or a phone and a tablet, come together in a way that makes sense for the user, allowing them to stay in their preferred workflow. And it actually works. So, for those who are paying attention, think about, Microsoft, phone link, or Intel Unison, but something that actually works. So
Right.
the experience was really seamless, and it was such a rich experience. And I agree with you that that's, at the end of the day, ultimately I think that AI will do that, right? AI at a minimum is going to take away friction, and is going to allow users to take more advantage of the hardware features that you're going to have, whether it is a PC or a phone. That
Right.
to me is, I know it might not be as exciting as, seeing a picture generated of a bear eating a rose, or whatever it is that I try to do. But it is what ultimately is going to get consumers to spend more money on devices and get more engaged on those devices, which is priceless for, the OEMs. So,
Yep. Yep. So on this point, AI on devices, increasing engagement, I think the main point that sticks out to me is, I mean, I don't view AI as disruptive. I view it as additive to all of these ecosystems. And so within that, we, have sort of had the what do you want to what do you want to say nicely, the late adopter of AI, right? Not the forefront leader or vocalist in Apple. Now starting to use AI language. Obviously, you know, in the investor event that came out last week, which is one of the things I fielded from a bunch of reporters, because apparently, Apple holds their investor day and something's going to happen that's exciting, and it was a non-event. But Tim Cook did come out and talk about generative AI, very specifically using generative AI as a term, and that Apple has plans and sees a vision for it. So clearly, they aren't ignoring this. They will address it, whether they're on board in the first boat, or the second or third boat. And then today launched new Macs, M3 MacBook Airs, with some very specific AI language. I think for the first time, actually, that generative AI in a press release was used, and they called out running LLMs locally, which is something that we've all been doing on our Macs, testing that for a while now. So they're not going to call this an AI PC. Going back to several bit by bit episodes we did on the AI PC, they'll never use that language, but they're using that term, trying to say the Mac is well positioned for AI, either in the cloud or on device, because of how much processing power it has, and positioning it right kind of within this trend that I think we'll see this year. So my takeaway is that was interesting that they're using the language.
Well, I mean, they might not call it the AIPC, but they got pretty damn close. In the press release, they said
Very.
world best consumer laptop for AI. I
Whew.
mean,
That's fighting words. That is fighting words to some other PC vendors.
but yeah, it is actually interesting that they felt compelled to be part of a conversation, right? Because we don't normally see Apple kind of give in to trends like that from a marketing perspective. They design their own course and they do what they need to do. But I, and we know, because we know what's coming in the second half of the year, where everything is going to be around AI PCs, and there's so much, right? If you're thinking about, we're expecting build, and then after build, the whole season with Google I/O, and then WWDC, all of that is going to be, I'm sure, all focused around
Yep.
AI and developers. And
Yep.
so I think that Apple had, not just from a hardware perspective, but it is really about positioning their silicon, which is the other thing that is interesting with Apple, is that on the PC side, we're gonna, battle between Qualcomm, Intel, and AMD and figuring out, from a silicon perspective, what's what. And whereas Apple, and then you have the on top of that, the PCs and the different brands trying to say which one of the all the OEMs is the best experience for an AI, and Apple is battling both, right? Is positioning
Yep.
the silicon and the hardware,
Right.
and
But
then
I
the
think
two combine as the ecosystem as well.
right. So I think the main point, to just put a button on the whole topic, was the momentum that we saw in that ecosystem from Mobile World Congress in terms of the device vendors, the silicon platform, the software evolution, and then what Apple's doing kind of tells me, while again, it's early, a lot of attention and now all of the major ecosystems for computing are going to be right there in this conversation, right? It's not going to be just let's just it might be coming like last year. Like we feel the momentum. Like this year is going to be stuff's out there, right? We're building this foundation to go develop for. And so I think by the end of this year or early next year, this time next year for sure, I think there'll be a lot more clarity on the consumer front. So going beyond just the enterprise front, which we all agree, very easy use cases there. So that to me means it feels like this year is going to be a foundational year, which is good for everybody. Toward the end of this year, all these questions we ask, what's going to work, who cares about what, I think that'll be a lot more clear by the end of the year.
I agree. I also think that this is like not a sprint, is definitely a marathon. And so really there's going to take time to flesh out, and also with that, figuring out, how consumer and enterprise are going to take advantage of it. And then from an ecosystem perspective, what developers can do on the back of it. And I think when it comes to Apple versus the rest of the world, data also will play a role, right? And I think we it's interesting to me how, for a lot of people, you say AI, generative AI, and people still think Siri. And so,
Mm,
they judge Apple as being behind because Siri has not developed as much as they were
right.
hoping, and definitely not as much as other assistants. But you are really talking about different things. And when you're looking at, even from an iPhone perspective, of where Apple is from a machine learning perspective, um, they're not actually that behind as people
Right.
think they are.
Right.
We just need to get thinking differently, and really separating, in my view, what is the virtual assistant a la Siri versus what generative AI can actually do based on data.
Yeah. Agreed. All right, let's wrap on that. The theme for 2024 continues to be AI, and that, amongst other things, we know what's coming down the pipe in terms of events and interesting things that will guide our topics for bit by bit. So until next time, thanks for listening and watching, because you're watching.